Okay, so I think it's about time I continue my Prime Minister series. If you recall, I've made a number of videos on previous British Prime Ministers, starting with Sir Robert Walpole in 1721. My last Prime Minister was Sir Alec Douglas-Home, who was Prime Minister for a relatively brief period from 1963 to 1964. So this brings me up to Prime Minister number 46, Harold Wilson. A few things I want to say before I continue because it has been a while since I've done this. These videos are not intended to be very, very in-depth and comprehensive. They're really intended to give a brief outline of the Premiership and the individual. I'm also trying to avoid too much partisan feeling. Obviously, I have my own idea of who were great prime ministers, who weren't, and my own political sympathies. But I'm trying to make them as neutral as possible. Not entirely, but to a large extent. Um, so I'm going to try and keep in mind that basis. And again, if there's a sound issue in this, I can only apologize. I really don't know what is going on. I've got headphones. I've got I've checked all the volume settings. I'm speaking directly into the microphone, so I really don't know what else I can do. Okay, so I find Harold Wilson one of our most interesting prime ministers. He presided over two periods of office, which is actually unique among um, post-war prime ministers, with the exception of Churchill. Churchill served on two intermittent occasions, but with the exception of Churchill and Wilson, every other modern prime minister has had one term, i.e., one tenure, some longer than others, some shorter. Until Tony Blair, Harold Wilson was the longest serving Labour prime minister. What I'm going to do is read out from the 10 Downing Street webpage, simply for simplistic reasons, and then talk a bit about other information about Wilson. He presided over a very important social period throughout most of the 1960s, where big social changes were happening all over the Western world. And for that reason, I think he is a relatively well known Prime Minister. He has been featured in a number of films. For example, Made in Dagenham, about the women's strike at the Dagenham Ford plant, and also in the film Legend about the Kray twins. So he is quite a well known figure in popular culture. Now, Wilson was a well known pipe smoker. I don't have a pipe, but I have a cigarette. And you'll excuse me, in the spirit of this video, if I have a little puff in honour of Harold Wilson. Incidentally, this was an era before politicians were bothered about public image and smoking. Wilson often smoked right in front of the cameras. Okay, so Harold Wilson was born in March 1916 in Huddersfield, West Yorkshire. I've been to Huddersfield and there's actually a statue to him there. There's a famous photograph of him standing outside Downing Street in about, I think it's about 1920, somewhat around then. He was very young at the time, might have been the mid 20s actually, during Baldwin's premiership, or MacDonald's premiership, in fact. And it's one of those interesting historic photos, you know, future leaders standing in front of a hall of power as a child. As Prime Minister, Harold Wilson enacted social reforms in education, health, housing, gender equality, price controls, pensions, provisions for disabled people, and child poverty. Harold Wilson, the son of a chemist and teacher, was born in Yorkshire, now West Yorkshire, during the First World War. In 1924, aged 8, that was right, he visited 10 Downing Street, which would eventually become his home. He studied modern history for a year before transferring to philosophy, politics, and economics at Oxford University, graduating with a first class BA. The Labour politician entered Parliament in 1945 as MP for Ormskirk and later becoming MP for Huyton. In 1947, then Prime Minister Clement Attlee made Wilson President of the Board of Trade. At 31, that's my age now, he had become the youngest member of the cabinet in the 20th century. So this really shows the wit and the political manoeuvring that Wilson had. Under Hugh Gaitskell's leadership of the Labour Party, Wilson served as Shadow Chancellor from 1955 to 1961, then as Shadow Foreign Secretary from 1961 to 1963. After Gaitskell passed away suddenly, Wilson fought and won a leadership contest against George Brown and James Callaghan. As Labour leader, he won 4 of the 5 general elections he contested, although this includes a minority government. His first election victory on the 15th of October 1964 saw him win with a small majority of 4, which increased significantly to 98 after a second general election on the 31st of March 66. Incidentally, he won that 64 election very much by playing up the fact that Sir Alec Douglas Hume was a peer, and this was now the mid 60s, so Wilson was very effective in knowing how to handle the media and playing up the image of his opponent as archaic and a realm of the past. As Prime Minister from 64 to 70, his main plan was to modernise. He believed that he would be aided by the white heat of the technological revolution, one of his best known speeches. His government supported backbench MPs in liberalising laws on censorship, divorce, abortion, and homosexuality. So, in American context, Wilson will probably be described as a progressive, although arguably even more than that. He was quite a left wing figure, though it would be a mistake, I think, to dismiss him as hard left. It's not that simple. And he abolished capital punishment. It's a bit important, I'll just add a brief reference here to the capital punishment issue. In the mid 60s, what had happened was there was a raging debate about the moral rights and wrongs of capital punishment. There had been a great difference in public opinion from the 1940s to the 1960s, and the film Pierpoint really shows us about one of Britain's last hangmen. By the 60s, society was becoming more liberal, and capital punishment was running out of favour. The last 2 men actually executed in this country were hanged simultaneously at Liverpool and Manchester prisons in August 1964. Now, they were the last executions, but at the time it wasn't really marked because the death penalty was still in the statute books. And I think it was formally abolished in 1967. Um, Homosexuality was also decriminalized around that time. So there were a lot of big social changes going on. Crucial steps were taken towards stopping discrimination against women and ethnic minorities, and Wilson's government also created the Open University. This was, of course, the time of Enoch Powell and the Rivers of Blood speech. There were serious racial tensions going on, and Wilson had to deal with that. In comparison, his outlook on foreign affairs was less modernising. He wanted to maintain Britain's world role by keeping the Commonwealth united and nurturing the Anglo American alliance. For example, his approach to the Vietnam War saw him skillfully balance modernist ambitions with Anglo American interests when, despite repeated American requests, he kept British troops out of Vietnam while still maintaining good relations with Washington. Wilson biographer Philip Ziegler characterizes his role as an honest broker. So, what you have with Harold Wilson is a man who had the foresight to know that Vietnam was a disaster. Um, and in my opinion, that was one of his strongest foreign policy achievements, keeping us out of Vietnam when we very well could have been dragged in, the way Australia and South Korea were. That is not to say that Wilson had a rocky relationship with Lyndon Johnson, because he didn't. But he had the foresight to maintain good relations with the US whilst opposing American policy, which is perhaps something that would be useful in today's context. However, he had to fundamentally reshape Britain's world role after inheriting an overstretched military and a £400 million balance of payments deficit, which caused successive sterling crises. To resolve these two interlocked problems, Wilson launched a defence review and created the Department for Economic Affairs, which sought to implement an ambitious national plan. When sterling crisis continued, Wilson was forced to devalue the pound in November 1967. 2 months later, his government reluctantly announced Britain's gradual withdrawal from the strategically important east of Suez. Despite his initial hesitation, Wilson recognised the value of membership of the AEC, but his 1967 application was unsuccessful, which says a lot about Labour's somewhat ambiguous attitude to the EU. Contrary to conservative views and Eurosceptic views, Labour is not a Europhile party by nature. Wilson called a general election on the 18th of June 1970, but suffered defeat by the Conservative Party under Edward Heath. I'm currently reading Ben Pinlock's biography of Wilson, and until the last minute, Labour had been doing well in the polls, but Heath managed to recuperate that. Wilson held on to the Labour leadership. The next general election on the 28th of February 74 resulted in a hung parliament, and he formed a minority government. He called another election on the 10th of October 74, at which he secured a small majority of three. His next 2 years as Prime Minister saw him concentrate heavily on domestic policy, achieving social reforms in education, health, housing, gender equality, price controls, pensions, provisions for disabled people, and child poverty. As a result, income tax on top earners increased to 83%. Job creation remained an issue. By 1975, unemployment had reached 1 million. So this is one of the perhaps weaker legacies of Harold Wilson, that the economy was not in a wonderful state. He limited the damage caused by differing opinions within his party during renegotiating of the terms of Britain's EEC membership. I would argue until the Jeremy Corbyn era, Labour was more divided at this time over internal squabbles than arguably at any time since until the Corbyn era. He also sought to resolve the troubles in Northern Ireland between the Nationalists and Unionists, but was ultimately unsuccessful. That was another major issue that Wilson had to deal with, the escalation of the troubles. In fact, when Harold Wilson was Prime Minister is when the troubles broke out with the Bogside riots in 1968 and 1969. On the 16th of March 1976, 5 days after his 60th birthday, he stunned the nation when he announced his intention to resign, a decision that he claimed had been made 2 years previously. James Callaghan, leader of the Labour Party, succeeded him to the role of Prime Minister. Although Callaghan was actually the older man, Wilson by this point was in poor health. He died in 1995 at the age of 79, and he was buried in the Isles of Scilly, which had been a real personal holiday retreat for Wilson and his family. Some major acts occurred during his tenure. The Murder Act of 1965, which was abolition of the death penalty, suspended the death penalty in England, Wales, and Scotland, but in reality, it was no longer in effect after 1967. Sexual Offences Act 1967, decriminalisation of certain homosexual offences. Of course, recently we've just had the posthumous pardoning or excusing, wiping away of the offences known as the Alan Turing Law, in which homosexual men were disgracefully persecuted prior to the 1960s. In 1969, he was struck in the eye by a stink bomb thrown by a schoolboy. This is under interesting facts. Wilson's response was, with an arm like that, he ought to be in the English cricket 11. Wilson had a great sense of humour, a great wit, very smart man. And I think it's fair to say, whatever people think of his politics, he's seen as one of our most intelligent prime ministers. He had a real sharp wit, Harold Wilson. Another interesting aspect of Wilson's tenure was the number of conspiracy theories that arose. These have emerged from about the 1990s onwards, have gained some prominence. Um, and one of them was that Wilson was, in fact, a Soviet agent. Now, if there was any truth in this, it would have been absolutely staggering that the leader of a Western nation was a Soviet double agent at the height of the Cold War. But MI5 investigated this and it basically had no basis. There was also an alleged 1974 military coup against Harold Wilson. My local MP, my former local MP, Chris Mullen, wrote a book, a thriller, I believe, that was loosely based on this. And in this alleged 1974 military coup, I'm just going to mention it briefly. On the BBC television programme The Plot Against Harold Wilson, broadcast in 2006, it was claimed that there were threats of a coup d'etat against the Wilson government, which was corroborated by leading figures of the time on both the left and right. Wilson told two BBC journalists, Roger Courtier and Barry Penrose, who recorded the meetings on a cassette tape recorder, that he feared he was being undermined by MI5. The first time was in the late 1960s after the Wilson government devalued the pound sterling, but the threat faded after Edward Heath won the election in 1970. However, after a coal miners' strike, Heath decided to hold an election to renew his mandate to govern in February 74, but lost narrowly to Wilson. There was again talk of a military coup, with rumours of Lord Mountbatten as head of an interregnal administration, after Wilson had been deposed. In 1974, the army occupied Heathrow Airport on the grounds of training for possible IRA terrorist action at the airport. However, Marcia Williams, a senior aide and close confidant of Wilson, asserted that the operation was ordered as a practice run for a military takeover or as a show of strength, as the government itself was not informed of such an exercise based around a key point in the nation's transport infrastructure. There's also been allegations by Peter Wright and so-called Clockwork Orange plot, which I will let people read up on further rather than going into too much detail in these videos. I'll just say though, in July '87, Labour MP, future Mayor of London, Ken Livingstone, used his maiden speech to raise the allegations of a former army press officer, Colin Wallace, that the army press office in Northern Ireland had been used in the 1970s as part of a smear campaign, codenamed Clockwork Orange, against Harold Wilson and all their British and Irish politicians. This certainly makes interesting reading. It's definitely James Bond style espionage intrigue. I think most of it has little basis in fact. Um, Wilson himself at times could be arguably seen as somewhat paranoid, um, but it is important to remember that this was the height of the Cold War, and it was known that Wilson had made trips to the Soviet Union. Um, so people can pass their own judgment. I don't believe that Wilson was a double agent. I think that's far fetched. It's certainly intriguing, but I think it's too far out there. So we'll leave it there. That is Harold Wilson. Incidentally, his rivalry with Heath was almost akin to the Gladstone-Disraeli rivalry of the 19th century. These two men were the giants of 1960s, 1970s politics, and both men dominated British politics at that time. So that is Harold Wilson, our 46th Prime Minister, and in my view, one of our most interesting. Summed up, Wilson would probably not be seen as an all-time great Prime Minister because of the internal party disputes, because of the less than wonderful state of the economy. But I think his reforming legislation was one of the most impressive of any prime minister since David Lloyd George. And for that reason, Wilson would certainly have to rank as consequential. So that is our 46th Prime Minister, Harold Wilson. Stay tuned for my subsequent videos. I'm going to try and be consistent with this. And thanks for watching.